Welcome, listeners, to the Let's Talk and Walk podcast. Today we are walking in the city, discussing a new, important, and interesting topic about a place that has been a flashpoint for conflict across centuries, Crimea. This deep dive is all about unpacking what makes this peninsula such a consistent center of geopolitical gravity, exploring why this relatively small piece of land keeps drawing global attention and conflict. We'll be looking at what makes it strategically unique and examining two periods where that significance really boiled over into war.
Absolutely. And when you look at Crimea on a map, its geography practically screams strategic. It's, almost entirely surrounded by water, the Black Sea and the smaller Sea of Azov.
Right.
And it's connected to the mainland by just this very narrow strip of land, the Isthmus of Perekop.
Yeah.
This unique position has made it, a prized asset for empires and nations for centuries, a real crossroads. And the core of that value, what gives it that enduring geopolitical gravity, is its command of the Black Sea, particularly through the port of Sevastopol.
Sevastopol.
Exactly. That's not something that changes with the flags flying over it. It's like a fundamental geographical constant driving conflict.
That makes perfect sense. It's like owning the key to a major sea. So let's jump into the first major conflict tied to this geography that we're exploring, the Crimean War back in the 1850s. What were the big drivers behind that war?
So the mid-19th century was dominated by what they called the Eastern Question. Think of the Ottoman Empire, huge power, but seen by many at the time, including Russia's Tsar Nicholas I. He famously called it the sick man of Europe,
Right.
as being in decline. Russia saw opportunities there for expansion, especially, towards the Mediterranean. The immediate fuse, what really kicked things off, was Russia moving troops into Ottoman territories along the Danube River, the Danubian principalities.
And I remember reading something about a religious dispute being mentioned as a trigger, but it was described more as a pretext. What does that tell us?
That's a really crucial point. The official justification Russia initially used involved protecting Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire.
Okay.
But as we see in the history, this was really a thinly veiled excuse. It tells us that powerful states often use seemingly noble or humanitarian reasons, like religious protection, to cover up deeper, maybe less palatable motives.
Yeah.
Imperial rivalry, power projection, grabbing strategic territory.
Yeah.
It's a pattern we see again and again, using pretexts for geopolitical gain.
Fascinating how that echoes. So who were the big players in this war? It wasn't just Russia and the Ottomans, was it?
No, not at all. While it started with Russia versus the Ottoman Empire, the situation escalated pretty quickly into a wider European conflict. The UK and France, they were worried about Russian expansion upsetting the balance of power, so they joined the Ottomans.
Yeah.
And later, the Kingdom of Sardinia also sent troops. Key battles included early clashes like Alma and Inkerman, but the defining, really brutal event was the Siege of Sevastopol.
Back to Sevastopol.
Exactly. It lasted for an incredibly long time, almost a full year, from October 1854 to September 1855. That siege really became the focal point.
A year-long siege. That sounds absolutely grueling, and this war is often called one of the first truly modern wars. What kind of new technologies and changes in warfare did that involve?
It really was a turning point. We saw the significant use of trench warfare, something that would unfortunately become much more prominent later on.
Right.
There were large-scale amphibious assaults getting troops from ships onto shore and widespread naval blockades. But the technology really began to change things. We saw the use of railways. The British even built the Grand Crimean Central Railway during the siege just to get supplies right to the front line.
Wow, during the siege.
Yeah. And the telegraph allowed for much faster communication, both for military orders and, significantly, for news getting back home to the public much quicker than before. Steamships meant troops and supplies moved faster, naval power changed. It wasn't just the fighting that was modern. The public's awareness, driven by this faster info flow, was new too. Plus, you get lasting legacies from this era, like Florence Nightingale's nursing reforms and the Victoria Cross for valor being established.
That shift in public awareness due to technology is a whole other layer of modern. So after this intense year-long siege, how did the war eventually end? What did the peace treaty look like? And, I guess importantly, did it actually bring lasting peace?
Well, the fall of Sevastopol was the decisive moment that pushed everyone to peace talks. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1856. Its main goals were basically to contain Russia and prop up the Ottoman Empire. It guaranteed Ottoman independence and territorial integrity. Crucially, it aimed to neutralize the Black Sea, meaning no warships allowed for either Russia or the Ottomans, and closing the Dardanelles Strait to all warships.
Yeah.
Russia also had to give up some territory in Bessarabia. The idea was definitely to create a stable, lasting peace. But sadly, no, it wasn't truly lasting.
Oh.
Russia unilaterally basically just ignored the Black Sea clauses of the treaty in 1870, only about 14 years later.
Just 14 years.
Yep. They just ignored that key disarmament part, and the other powers, kind of preoccupied elsewhere, largely let them get away with it. It showed that diplomatic peace, even after a huge war, can be pretty fragile when those underlying ambitions are still there.
Right, so the strategic prize was still sitting there and the ambitions hadn't vanished. Okay, let's fast forward now to the 21st century and the more recent conflicts over Crimea. How did Crimea even end up as part of Ukraine after the Soviet Union broke up? What was its status, say, before 2014?
Right, so Crimea's administrative path within the Soviet Union is key here. It had been part of the Russian SFSR for a long time, going way back. But then in 1954, the Soviet leadership decided to transfer it from the Russian SFSR to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic.
Why did they do that?
Well, it was presented at the time as maybe a symbolic gift, perhaps marking an anniversary of Russian-Ukrainian unity, or maybe just for administrative convenience given its connections to mainland Ukraine. When Ukraine became independent in 1991, Crimea kept an autonomous status within it. And importantly, Russia kept its historic Black Sea fleet base in Sevastopol under a treaty signed with Ukraine in 1997.
So Russia still had a major military presence there.
Exactly. There were some tensions in the early 90s about this, but they were managed, and large-scale conflict was actually avoided for decades.
Okay, so it had this complex history, autonomy within Ukraine,
Yeah.
Russian base. Given that relatively stable is sometimes tense setup, what specifically triggered the crisis and the annexation in 2014?
The immediate catalyst was Ukraine's Revolution of Dignity in February 2014. That led to the ousting of President Yanukovych, who was seen as more pro-Russian.
Right, I remember that.
Following this, very rapidly, we saw Russian President Vladimir Putin initiate plans to, as he later put it, return Crimea to Russia. Within days, unmarked troops who got nicknamed Little Green Men started seizing key strategic sites across the peninsula. Government buildings, airports, military bases. It was swift, unannounced.
Undercover, basically.
Pretty much. Under that occupation, a pro-Russian administration was quickly installed. And then a referendum on joining Russia was announced and held just a couple of weeks later, March 16th, 2014. The official results claimed, overwhelming support, but the whole process done under military occupation without international observers is widely seen as illegitimate, not recognized internationally.
So not seen as a free and fair vote.
Not by most of the world, no. Crimea then formally declared independence and was absorbed into the Russian Federation. This initial phase, this mix of covert military action, politics, information ops, it became a textbook example of hybrid warfare.
Hybrid warfare, yeah, that term keeps coming up. Given how quickly that all unfolded, what's the international community's stance on this annexation? Is it considered legal at all?
Unequivocally, no. The international consensus is overwhelming and clear. Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 is illegal under international law.
Okay.
It's seen as a fundamental violation of core principles set up after World War II, like the UN Charter's ban on acquiring territory by force, and the principle of territorial integrity, basically, that you can't just change another country's borders by force.
Right. Basic rules.
Exactly. UN General Assembly resolutions, other international bodies, they all reflect this widespread non-recognition. Crimea is internationally viewed as Ukrainian territory under temporary Russian occupation. Russia has offered various justifications, historical claims, the referendum results, claims of protecting ethnic Russians, even citing this controversial idea of remedial secession.
What's that?
It's the idea that a group can secede if their human rights are being severely violated. But these arguments are widely dismissed as legally unfounded, seen by many as part of a tactic sometimes called lawfare.
Lawfare?
Yeah, using or twisting legal arguments to try and legitimize actions that actually violate international law.
Got it. So a strong consensus against it legally. Beyond the legal and political stuff, what have been the broader geopolitical and economic consequences since 2014? It clearly didn't stop there.
Oh, absolutely not. Geopolitically, the annexation dramatically escalated East-West tensions. It contributed to a renewed arms race, increased military readiness, especially among NATO countries bordering Russia. Russia was suspended from the G8. The international community, led by the US and EU, imposed extensive sanctions targeting Russia's economy, individuals. NATO significantly boosted its focus on collective defense and support for Eastern European members and Ukraine. Russia, meanwhile, has heavily militarized the Crimean Peninsula since taking control.
And inside Russia.
Domestically, the initial annexation actually gave Putin a significant boost in popularity. It was framed in very nationalistic terms, but globally it set a really dangerous precedent. It risks legitimizing unilateral land grabs by force, potentially undermining the whole international order built on respecting sovereignty and borders. And this conflict, as we know, quickly spread beyond Crimea into the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine, and then ultimately escalated into the full-scale invasion we've seen more recently. Russia's position remains that recognizing the annexation is a precondition for any peace.
Wow. And economically, what happened to Crimea itself, and maybe more broadly?
Economically, Crimea itself faced pretty severe consequences. It became largely isolated from international trade and finance because of sanctions, and Ukraine cut off supplies like water and electricity early on.
That must have hurt.
Big time. Its tourism industry, once important, suffered significantly. The peninsula has become heavily dependent on subsidies from Moscow. Most of its budget comes from Russia now. Now, Russia has invested heavily in infrastructure projects like the Kerch Strait Bridge connecting Crimea to Russia and the Tavrida Highway across the peninsula.
Like the bridge.
But even those investments face risks of becoming, stranded assets because of sanctions and potential future changes in control. Crimea's economy has also shifted more towards the military sector. For residents, while state employees maybe saw initial salary bumps in rubles, prices for goods spiked. And by 2023, Crimea was actually among the lowest income regions within Russia. And the broader economic impact: increased defense spending globally, market volatility, significant effects on Russia's overall economy, despite their efforts at resilience and finding ways around sanctions.
It's clear the consequences are massive, politically, economically.
Yeah.
But there's also a profound human cost, isn't there? Especially for people living under occupation in Crimea. What are we seeing there?
The human cost is just devastating, and it keeps mounting. The broader conflict has led to massive displacement, millions forced from their homes, inside Ukraine and as refugees, and tragically, hundreds of thousands of casualties.
Terrible.
But specifically in occupied territories like Crimea, human rights abuses are well documented and systemic. We've seen forced disappearances. Reports suggest at least 45 people have gone missing in Crimea since 2014 with very little accountability. There were widespread reports of torture and ill treatment, particularly targeting minorities like Crimean Tatars and ethnic Ukrainians, sometimes even involving punitive psychiatric confinement.
That's horrific.
It is. Unlawful killings have also been documented, again, with impunity for perpetrators. Prison conditions are harsh. And there's a deliberate policy of Russification being implemented.
Russification.
Meaning restricting the use of Ukrainian language and culture, attacking religious minorities seen as disloyal, coercing teachers in schools, forcing residents to take Russian passports, and significant population transfers. Reports suggest maybe up to 800,000 Russians have moved into Crimea since 2014, while around 100,000 Ukrainians have left. There are even reports of confiscated Ukrainian homes being given to Russian soldiers.
Replacing the population.
It has elements of that, yes. Vulnerable groups face disproportionate impact, struggling with poverty, access to resources. And there's been a significant rise in domestic violence, often linked to the stresses of conflict. It's also worth noting the sources mention Ukrainian authorities have imposed some restrictions under martial law, too, for example, on freedom of expression in certain areas.
That is incredibly grim. A stark reminder of the human toll behind these big geopolitical struggles. Okay, looking back now at both the 19th century war and the 21st century conflict, what similarities and, I guess, key differences really stand out?
There are some really striking echoes, actually. The most consistent theme is Russia's persistent drive, expansion, or influence towards the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. That ambition seems constant over centuries.
Right.
Both conflicts also highlight the use of stated reasons, the religious dispute in the 1850s, protecting ethnic Russians and historical claims in 2014 as, pretexts for deeper geopolitical aims. It just shows this recurring reliance on historical narratives and perceived grievances to justify aggression. And of course, Crimea's unchanging strategic significance, its location, Sevastopol, that remains the fundamental, enduring reason it keeps drawing conflict. It's the constant factor.
It's fascinating how that core geography and the strategic desire tied to it just persists. But the world's response seems so different between the 1850s and today. How'd that differ so much?
That's a profound divergence, yeah. It reflects a massive shift in international norms, or at least stated norms. The Crimean War ended with a formal negotiated treaty, the Treaty of Paris. It reflected the 19th century balance of power system. Great powers could directly intervene. Territorial adjustments were more fluid after conflicts.
Okay.
In stark contrast, the 2014 annexation is almost universally condemned as a clear violation of the post-World War II international legal order, particularly the UN Charter, territorial integrity.
So the rules changed.
The stated rules, yes. The response hasn't been a negotiated settlement accepting the facts on the ground, but rather non-recognition of the annexation, extensive international sanctions against the aggressor, support for the victim's sovereignty, instead of direct military intervention by Western powers like in the 1850s. This difference really highlights how the international community officially views the rules today compared to 150 years ago, even if enforcing those rules is, well, clearly a challenge.
And the nature of warfare itself has clearly evolved dramatically, too.
Oh, absolutely. The Crimean War was early modern warfare, right? Seeing the beginnings of tech like railways, telegraphs influencing things alongside trench warfare.
Yeah.
The 2014 conflict, though, is very much defined by hybrid warfare, that mix of conventional and unconventional tactics, covert ops, sophisticated and rapid info campaigns, heavy propaganda, cyber attacks, that lawfare we mentioned.
Yeah.
The speed, the complexity, the reach of conflict are just vastly different today.
And even the very idea of peace feels fundamentally different between the outcomes of these two conflicts.
It does. The Crimean War ended with a formal treaty that explicitly aimed for lasting peace, even if its terms were later ignored, as we said. The 2014 conflict, however, has no recognized peace agreement. It's characterized by ongoing occupation, ongoing conflict, with Russia explicitly demanding international recognition of its annexation as a precondition for any kind of settlement.
So no deal unless everyone accepts the land grab.
That's essentially Russia's public position. It suggests a shift from formal agreements trying to create a new balance to this protracted struggle for legitimacy and acceptance of facts created by unilateral force.
This comparative look really underscores the deep historical roots and the persistent nature of conflict around Crimea.
Yeah.
What does it tell us about unresolved conflicts and the challenges to the international order we face today?
It definitely reinforces that Crimea remains a core, unresolved issue driving so much of the current geopolitical tension. It highlights the persistence of great power rivalries and how deep-seated ambitions can challenge established international norms and security structures, especially that post-WWII legal framework based on sovereignty. It also starkly illustrates the difficulty the international community has in effectively enforcing international law and holding powerful states accountable for violations, especially when those states are willing to bear the cost of sanctions and isolation. And beneath all the geopolitics, it's just a tragic reminder of the severe and ongoing human cost when these conflicts persist and human rights are systematically abused in occupied territories.
It leaves you with a lot to think about, doesn't it? This isn't just ancient history. It's playing out right now with modern consequences built on centuries of similar drivers. It makes you wonder what the implications are for the future of international law and global stability if core grievances remain unresolved and powerful states feel they can act with, well, what seems like impunity sometimes. It's certainly a complex picture with no easy answers.
Indeed, no easy answers at all.
All right, that wraps up our walk for today. It definitely gave us a lot to think about, maybe something to mull over with a coffee or a snack. It was a really interesting one, and we truly hope you all listening enjoyed it as much as we did. Thanks for joining us. We greatly value your engagement. If you found this episode informative, please consider leaving a like. We also welcome your suggestions for new topics and areas you'd like us to cover in future episodes. Feel free to share those in the comments section. And finally, to ensure you don't miss out on our upcoming content, please hit the subscribe button and share it with your friends. We look forward to bringing you more interesting discussions. Thank you for listening to the Let's Talk and Walk podcast.